Yep. Could you just introduce yourself?
So my name is Srinivas Aditya Mopidevi. I'm a writer, curator and educator. I'm based in New Delhi and I'm originally from Hyderabad, but I studied art history curating across Baroda, Delhi and New York, and I primarily work with artists on an everyday basis and making exhibitions, and also all kinds of programs that are actually facilitating the presentation or convening of artistic practices. So that's what mainly I do, and also as of now I teach at Ashoka University as a visiting professor, and also I work as a lead curator at Dhi Contemporary, a gallery in Hyderabad, and also run a Pollinated Auto, which is an experimental art space founded by artist Tukur and Tagra. So those are the kind of the few things among many other things that I do. So yeah.
Could you share your overarching approach to curating, or how do you view your practice?
So one of the things whenever I think about curating, I think curating is one of the few spaces that really has the capacity to access, intervene and reconfigure forms of public memory. I would say how public will remember certain things, and I think artistic practice still has the power to intervene into the public consciousness and has to create, whether we're talking about cinema, whether we're talking about performance, whether we're talking about visual art. And since in the contemporary times, curator happens to be this person who brings these voices together in their continuity and complexity, the fundamental role then happens to be one that is both ethical, responsible, at the same time sensitive to how we are inserting or introducing artistic voices into the public consciousness. And I think that's, I would say, one of the most important, at the same time exciting possibilities of being a curator.
Yeah. How do you based on what you think is important and within just curation, how do you then decide what you work on, or what kind of exhibitions you decide to do, or what kind of art do you highlight?
Well, fundamentally, I think a lot of it, this process of curating, or at least curating for me, is being attentive to artistic practices, like looking, seeing, knowing completely different kind of, and not limiting yourself to a specific context or situations, and constantly knowing what's happening in the world, and also in different parts of the country, not just from the art centers. So for me, looking, listening and understanding, and also responding, there are many, sometimes you see artworks that you don't know any context of, but you don't know who the artist is, but there is a certain sense of twitch that happens in your body, which is an intuitive response, I call. And whenever that happens for me, I kind of stay with that kind of response and then keep thinking about it, and then sometimes this mulling over it kind of stays on for a couple of years or a year or even more, and sometimes even longer than that. So that then what happens is that then one way to kind of get it out of your system or get it out of your mind is to actually curate an exhibition, so that you kind of create a form to the kind of the response that an artistic practice or a set of artistic practices has created. For example, recently I did a show on granularity and photography and moving image in Hyderabad and Dhi Contemporary, where I do as lead curator, where I brought together around 9 artistic practices that respond to the idea of granularity. And the idea of graininess and granularity as perceptions of the world is something that has stayed with me since 2017, when I was conversing with the work of Walid Raad, one of the very well-known Lebanese photographers based in New York. So things like that. So in a way, there are these ideas through artworks that just continue to stay in your head. And then what you do is to eventually to see not just that, but actually where it takes you in terms of conversation with other artistic voices, and then bring together to present it to the public in a way that is more accessible. Yeah.
Yeah. So, have you noticed there are the certain concepts or like certain themes or ideas that you have come back to a lot, and like explored throughout your work, as you mentioned with like the idea of granularity?
It depends upon sometimes what it hits, right? Like for example, the another one which I did an exhibition on the idea of the horizon, right? A mentor of mine many years ago when I was in JNU said something to the end of, we kind of look at life in politics as a destination that we have to arrive, but life in politics is often a horizon, it is always constantly recalibrating itself as you move forward in time and space, right? So that kind of thought didn't leave me for almost like 10 years in terms of thinking through. And then eventually I made a exhibition. I'm presented an exhibition at Nature Mart called Infinite Reminders, which looks at draws from what my mentor has said and think about how does horizon become a site of both respite and political imagination. You can see it as something that is absolutely aesthetic and beautiful, but you can also look at it as something that the world has to kind of look towards a horizon in terms of its own actioning to a better world. So in a way, most often what happens is some kind of either artworks or ideas or something, they just trigger and they just stay. And another very interesting recent example is I was doing a mentorship to an artist in the context of a grant called Crispa Sumatre. He's from Darjeeling, and when I was looking at his portfolio, there's this one work which was titled I have so much poetry inside me, but it is written in the wrong language. And it was the title of the work, and he was inspired by some other conversation that he heard somewhere else. But in his own personal context, that's one of the most profound statements that I felt. How does like having poetry in the wrong language mean? What does having poetry in the wrong language? So in a way, what does having poetry inside you but it's written in the wrong language, what does the wrong language mean? What happened was eventually we did an exhibition that says I have so much poetry inside me, there's a lot of poetry inside me, it's written in the wrong language. So which is a solo exhibition we did in Delhi in March this year. So what I'm trying to say is that sometimes some things just come and sit in your head and you kind of don't know why. But then you realize that these ideas have some kind of resonance to you, and as a curator, I always believe that if something moves you, then there's a potential that it might also move other people, and you become then the interface to diversify it, make it accessible and present it to the wider public so that they also understand it and enter that conversation. So that's where I think that the curatorial role lies, whether you can actually absorb these profundities and find a way to circulate them in ways that you can, or and within your own context and beyond.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think that something like poetry in the wrong language also kind of maybe especially correlates to the context in which we live. So especially if you consider like South Asia and if you consider India too, like defining a correct language might be quite difficult.
Absolutely. And also who has the access to that kind of language and what language we're talking about, right? It's also, all of these are contingencies that are constantly changing, right? Like tomorrow somebody will come up to say, oh, you can't use the Hindi language or you can't use this language because of XYZ reasons. So what is this possibilities or challenges that one is talking about? And I think when I actually first time read it, it never really left and it's interesting, some ideas just keep you up at night and not in a bad way, And I think, thankfully, that's the power of art at the end of the day, despite all the clutter that happens in the
world. Yeah. Definitely. I was like looking through a lot of your work, and I noticed that two projects that you were involved in at Pollinator are related to like climate change. So the first one was called like Don't Follow the Wind, and one was Sustainer India. Can we chat about those a little bit?
So there are three projects. Don't Follow the Wind is actually a project by a bunch of friends of mine from Japan. One is actually an American academic curator based in Oxford and between Oxford and Japan, and then one is a collective based called Jimpom based in Tokyo, who started the project. It's a project that was meant to kind of provoke the I thought that, what happens to the exhibition if it is in a nuclear radiation zone, and what happens to an exhibition if nobody is able to see it, and how do I install an exhibition that can only be seen after the nuclear radiation becomes like less, and then the people can actually become inhabitants of this space. So it's one of these profound projects that started at least 10-12 years ago, which had a lot of similarly the same kind of impact on me, that it kept coming to me, and then finally, thankfully, that we had a little bit of they do something called the non-visitor center, which is like a fragment from that project in different parts of the world as a way of talking about the project, but not completely fully presenting the project. So we presented a fragment of that film and a small installation in Delhi at Tukral and Takra studio, which is also where we occasionally present the pollinator exhibitions. So that's what Don't Follow the Wind is. It's actually a beautiful story of when the nuclear radiation happened in Fukushima. There was one guy who runs to the family and then puts everything in the car, and the whole family boards the car, and then they were driving towards one direction, and then he gets a call and say, don't follow the wind because the radiation is actually coming with the wind, and then he takes a U-turn and then goes towards south of Tokyo. So the idea of the Don't Follow the Wind comes from that particular moment of how the wind also brings the radiation with it, and if you actually follow the wind, that means you're actually the radiation is following you. So you need to kind of go into the parallel direction of the wind so that the radiation is not affecting you in the same way. So that's where the whole framework of, and it's also a project that has been shown in various contexts and situations in different parts of the world, and Chimpom, who are the initiators of the project, are one of the amazing activist collectives, and I have actually showed them in 2016 in a show at the Korean Cultural Center in New Delhi, different body of work which was also made in the context of Fukushima. So their engagement with Fukushima has been long-standing, and this is a testament of that kind of engagement. And the second one is Sustaina, which is initiated along with it was Tukral and Tagra with the artist duo. They were invited by the CW, which is the Center for Energy, Environment and Water in New Delhi, to kind of bring together a kind of art, science and climate kind of initiative. So Sustaina started looking at the questions of materiality, looking at the questions of what happens to sustainability in the context of art, all of that. And then we started, our first edition happened in Delhi last year with around 10 artists, and the second edition is going to happen in Delhi again this year on the 1st of February. We're actually in the process of preparing for it. Sustaina basically is a art kind of initiative that is dedicated to how art can actually, the power of art in terms of explaining about the state of things in terms of planetary realities, and then at the same time also thinking more materially in terms of sustainable practices. So that's what we are looking at. And the third one, since you were talking about sustainability, which is also something very close to my heart, is this project called Climate Recipes, which I and Srinivas Aditya, another collaborator of mine, started in Goa last year, which basically started with the basic intention of going to these people who have lived with land and environment for a very long time to just gather their life recipes. If you were to give one recipe, what would have life for combating climate change or existing with the world the way it is, the way it's transforming, what could that be? So Climate Recipes then ended up talking to 25 experts in Goa, 25 experts in Hyderabad, in Telangana and Andhra Pradesh, and then 25 experts in Odisha about very different questions regarding to the sustainable livelihoods, about food systems, about agriculture, about sustainable architecture, all kinds of questions. So now they are made into books, which are, have illustrations, drawings, descriptions, and flowcharts that people can actually. So it's basically a form of a intergenerational wisdom gathering exercise, because we believe the fact that there's so much knowledge around us, we don't have to import frameworks and knowledges. There's enough knowledge that we just have to figure out a platform to bring it all together and put it together, both in terms of books, exhibitions, and workshops and other kinds of conventions. So that's the three kind of the arc of my work, recent work with climate sustainability and other questions.
I had basically in the beginning you talked about how one of the ways that you define your role is how you make things accessible to people, but with Don't Follow the Wind, how was there a negotiation between kind of preserving the original state of the exhibit in Fukushima and then still allowing audiences around the world to access part of it? And how do you think that, how do you change the medium or change the way that information is disseminated to kind of do justice to the original idea of inaccessibility?
Well, the idea of, in a project like Don't Follow the Wind, the idea of the originality of material is not something that they are so attached to be very honest. I think what they are interested in that is that how do we make this idea as expansive in terms of its circulation as possible, right? Because they are also in some way building solidarity about the issue and trying to make awareness, because a lot of people don't even understand what does the nuclear radiation do to you, right? Many people don't even have a sense of what does something like a nuclear radiation can actually do to your body and how it's inhabitable, non-inhabitable, and so on. So the film basically there was a central 3-channel film that these guys made, which talks about slowly the biodiversity growing in the Fukushima region after 10-15 years, because they had cameras that kind of had wild boars and others slowly coming in, porcupines, etc. So in a way, it was also talking about that in 10 years or 12 years of an exhibition, there are also transitions in terms of what the exhibition means, because there's a 4% of the area that could be open to accessible to public, and then how does that change something that you can never visit, suddenly part of it becomes accessible? What kind of meanings does it generate, right? So in that way, what is the interesting part about this is that the thought of it is something that really can transcend across contextual boundaries, at the same time, there is no truth-telling narrative that we are trying to say. We are trying to actually, the members of the Don't Follow the Wind collective are actually trying to, of course, present a reality, but also resonating it with all kinds of realities. For example, closer to home, one could look at what happened to Bhopal and the kind of the ramifications of that. Even today in the Bhopal landscape is a very good example, after the chemical leak. So it's more of that kind of expansive discursive engagement rather than trying to tell, I'm going to tell to T what happened in the Fukushima, even though it does present a very comprehensive picture of what's happening on ground. They have war and safety equipment and all the team of the Don't Follow the Wind went and spent time there, etc. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. So you do you see this project as kind of playing the role of just catalyzing more discourse about nuclear disaster?
Yeah, and also what happens what happens to a reality when nobody talks about it, right? And does the reality does it become non-existent when nobody is talking about it? And I think it's an important question, right? Because the groundwater is still polluted, the radiation is still existing, and somewhere art becomes that space where you could bring that kind of change, or at least keep the memory of it alive. And while I was a distant noticer of this project, actually Jason Waite and Jim Palm and other members of the Don't Follow the Wind group have actually actively participated in taking this kind of conversations to different parts of Japan and the world, and also East Asia, to be very honest. to understand what they would respond, right? How do they kind of relate to it or respond to it? Yeah.
Great. Moving to the second project that you talked about, which was Sustaina India. Could you talk a little bit about how you talked about materiality and how you bring that into the idea of sustainability. I also read that the exhibition had a very sensory approach to it, so you concentrated a lot on touch and smell and sound and things like that. Could you explain the process of just organizing that, and how did you get to that decision?
See, the point is, artists more often are these people who want to think about the change in the world even before the change become a commonplace, right? So artists always have that kind of future thinking, not in a not in a capitalist future thinking way, but more in a habitable world thinking way. What would be the future of art? What would be the future of life? What would be the future of our consciousness look like, despite of what? Yeah, exactly. And then and thinking forms that can really imagine this, right? And also at the same time, this also comes with a sense of reflecting on what's happening in front of us. Like, for example, Rachna Toshniwal, one of the fellows of Sustaina, he still today has this beautiful studio called the Other Side Studio in Alibag next to the ocean, right? So in every day in the morning walk, she used to have this waste material coming up the shore of the Saral beach in Alibag. And then for the longest time, she didn't really know what to think of it, and every day she used to be very bothered by seeing this. But then one day she kind of thought, okay, I want to do something with it. I want to make a tapestry of waste. And then she brings up these waste, cleans them, and then color codes, divides them to a point of color code, and then collaborates with a local weaving community of women there, and then starts to make this beautiful crochet and these aquatic objects and things like that. And this makes this humongous installation, which you would never believe is actually made out of the waste that came from the ocean, right? And it's also a question of what do we mean when we mean by waste anyway, right? What does the framework of waste mean? It's a very beautiful, and suddenly you have this really stunning looking objects that come out of it, sometimes even found like that, and then kind of question that then who's the artist? Is it the ocean? Is this the mediator? What is the kind of the understanding? So, and then also suddenly we displayed it also in a certain way, as if in a huge a plank, as if it's an ocean bed with all these threads and objects and figures that are carved. I don't know if you see images, you'll be able to relate to what I was saying. So how does that part really relay into talking about? Because more often what happens is, even before we think of understanding something deeply, we kind of tend to jump into solution, because we don't have the patience of really looking into what the diversity or complexity of a particular problem is. Waste is not just about segregating at home. Waste is not just about not littering outside. It's much more complex geopolitical issue across the world than just beyond just looking at it what you dispense at your household level, right? Which is also important, and I'm not saying it's not important, but it's a much more a global issue of materiality, to be very honest. So that was one example. And then we have Manjot Kaur, another fellow, who basically wanted to think with forests and in a very mythical way, in a spiritual way, and then went and documented all these textures of forest, untouched forest in indigenous lands of Canada, and then brought a kind of a little bark tree solution that kind of smell give a little sense of that smell of that forest. And then she put it in a dispenser, so when you actually walk in to see these images, which are in a 3-channel video installation, you actually also have this smell that's filling the room, and then really hoping to give you that sensorium of it. And then the third one is Debashmita Ghosh, who is from Kolkata and had this really amazing revelation and presented to the public of how the indigenous communities of Odisha, the moment they shifted from mud house to cement houses, the whole dynamic of the community has changed, right? So what happens when something as simple as the building material, which is like mud that was there for like centuries and even like millenniums, have shifted the interpersonal community logic and dynamic of the indigenous community just because the asbestos roof and the cement has come about. For example, there was never a compound walls for the cone houses, but with the cement coming into picture, because the plan of these houses that are sanctioned houses have a compound wall, etc., the compound wall kind of suddenly pops in the middle of nowhere, right? So yeah, so that kind of creates a new division. This is my wall, this is your wall kind of division, which was not actually prevalent if you look at it in the history of the cone community within Odisha historically. So how can this is a testament of how something like a similar simple material shift can actually completely alter the ecology of a whole like a traditional and even like Adivasi community, right? So these are the kind of some of the like the tangents that were presented within Sustaina where these are real shifts that were in front, and then what happens is that the think tank or all the kinds of the thing, they're very well versed with the data and the solution driven approach, but we are not really creating experiential spaces where people can actually absorb the realities of what's happening in a full holistic way. So yeah, that's what we were doing.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense, especially the thing that you were talking about where like material influences like ecology and things like that. I wanted to ask about how like basically you also mentioned that you collaborated with the CEEW for Sustaina. How do you think, like, obviously while retaining the like kind of like purity of just talking about sustainability and kind of creating just like an immersive experience through art, how did you intersect that with science, or did their collaboration in specific like play a role in the direction that you took Sustaina in?
See, CEW basically invited Tukral and Tagra to curate Sustaina because they wanted the collaboration of art from the kind of the research-driven, data-driven expertise that they already had about a lot of aspects of Indian eco and also world ecosystem in general, because they're a team of researchers that are quite policy advocacy and also data driving, looking at data, etc. So for them, a lot of these issues were very important in terms of, for example, there's a whole team thinking about waste, there's a whole team thinking about food systems, there's a whole team thinking about the unseasonal rainfall. Like there's a lot of like different fragments of like there's of course energy transition, circular economy, all these part of the thinking that happens. So which becomes data, which is a data-driven kind of approach, research approach. So for them, they also wanted how do you make this data accessible or make this research accessible, or even bring in facets of this research and amplify it, or identify what are the key issues and then figure out a way in which we can bring artists or other kind of creative practitioners to put it out into the public in more powerful ways. So I think that is what they were looking for when they invited Tukral and Tagra, and it so happened that at the time Tukral and Tagra and I started collaborating on pollinators. So we ended up like working and actually even starting the main principal ambition of what Sustaina India should do in its own way. Yeah.
So you kind of looked at the research that was done about sustainability and try to highlight that throughout. That makes a lot of sense.
Yes, and we also had before even that, I mean, of course it was very instrumental in understanding the wider scope of research that's going on, but at the same time we also had a sense of like what was the possibilities that the field of art already offers in terms of their conversations, research, because there are also a lot of, for example, Gaurav J. Gupta, who runs the Karo design, for example, has been researching about how do I convert the PM 2.5 particles into a dye by ink in collaboration with the A-Ring, where it is talking about how can we repurpose the particle material that is excessively produced in the ecosystem into something that is more like useful and generative or even sustainable. And he ended up making this whole beautiful installation called Kal Chakra, which was at the middle of the exhibition, and it was very, very well received because people couldn't believe that actually pollution can actually be something that can be translated into an ink and then ended up being a textile dye, and then something that's actually quite gorgeous to look at. So yeah.
That does sound wonderful. The third thing you talked about was climate recipes. Could you give me like a couple of examples of just what do you mean by creating a climate recipe? So was it more oriented towards kind of looking at the lifestyles of these people that kind of live in congruence with the land and kind of documenting their lifestyles, or is it just like specific parts of them?
So one of the thing about recipes basically fundamentally a set of instructions, right? That's the core role of a recipe, right? It's meant to give, and the most other role of the recipe is that it's also a beautiful way of passing intergenerational knowledge. You have grandmother's recipes that are in every kitchens, etc., right? So what we thought was, why don't we gather a set of instructions from people who have lived closer to the land and the environment, with an understanding that there are recipes in all of us. It's just that somebody has to identify them, converse with them, and archive them in a certain way. So for example, Damodar Mozo is a very celebrated Goan author who we met with in Goa, who basically said that he was talking about this old Goan saying that says that the tallest building in the village shouldn't be more than the tallest coconut tree, because to kind of say that we should not get greedy beyond the tallest coconut tree, because as long as it is below the coconut tree we are all fine, but the moment it goes beyond the height of the coconut tree is when the greed kind of hits in. So it's an old Goan saying. Then he was remembering that is a kind of a degrowth recipe in the word to think about. Make sure that the tallest building in your village is lower than the tallest coconut tree is a way of measuring the greed economy that kind of goes into the skyscrapers and obsessive takeover of the landscapes and things like that. And the second one is for example, there is this very visionary environmentalist in Goa called Rajendra Kerkar. He basically said you have to train your tongue because the global food supply chain is going to break and you won't be getting all the kind of the things that you love, like Thai, Italian every day, or whatever you want, like to desire. So then you will be forced to eat whatever is around you. So rather than waiting for that doomsday, you just try to start to train your tongue, whatever is around you, just to kind of start to make and eat it. And he's like an advocate of thinking about what are the wild vegetables that are available, what are the different kinds of food possibilities that are there within the traditional ways of cooking, and whether we are archiving those knowledges or not. So he said that sustainability starts with your training your tongue, and it's a very beautiful way of saying that sustainability is in your body. You just have to realign it into its ecosystem. Yeah. So those are kind of the recipes that we ended up gathering in terms of and what are these one-liners of wisdom that let you enter into a whole field of thinking about agroecology, sustainability, the questions of land and environment and biodiversity, all of these questions. And I think an exhibition of this is going to happen, but that is looking at more what happens to the materiality of art in the wake of climate change, looking at artists from across the world, which is going to happen end of next year in Goa. So we are currently working on it's a full-scale international exhibition that talks about what does the materiality of art hold in the wake of climate change. It's not about artists using sustainable materials, but what happens to the very materiality of art itself in the wake of climate change. Yeah. More about thinking about, if you're a painter, how would you think about climate change? If you're a sculptor, how would you think about it? Or what kind of material thinking that one would do in terms of looking into the future? So, like for example, something like clay survived civilizations and centuries, right, across political, and there is a whole thesis of thinking about clay as long as going to the prehistoric, like the historical Chinese, ceramic pottery, to so many different other cultures and civilizations, right, across India and other parts of the world also. So if you were to map the trajectory of clay, thinking about it as a materiality and what is its trajectory both within a South Asian and other kind of context, it's kind of beautiful to map these kind of journeys, because when we look at a pot, we don't really think about the clay, right? But then somewhere we have to all think about the story of the clay to understand what's the past and future of this materiality is. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Yeah, just in general, to like wrap this up, you're also a professor at Ashoka University right now. So how do you like kind of integrate your like research experiences and your curatorial experiences and like your own philosophies like into your teaching?
So one of the most important teaching for me is a retention practice. For me, we are in a generation where we are hyperstimulated. I teach a generation which is hyperstimulated, stressed, fatigued, burnt out, or always like trying to do more things than they can. I'm also doing it. I'm also complicit in it, so don't think I'm an exception. But at the same time, I think what art provides is this one like fragment of time where retention can still be mobilized, still be a possibility, some sense of reorientation of your vision beyond the tunnel vision of what I'm going to do, where I'm going to work kind of thing, a kind of a moment to think about what is the relationship with my body and the life and the world and whatever around me, how do I reassess these kind of relationships. So when I'm in the classroom, thankfully it's in like an art kind of driven courses. So what happens is we look at artists to see what are these kind of larger lessons or larger wisdom that is more than lessons, more like wisdom that they're embarking on, like imparting in people. And that's where I think, and I go and I say this, I go with an absolute open mind. I don't want to judge what background you come from in terms of whether you know about art or don't know about art. We are all in the same kind of space, and then we come together. And more often it's how happened that people who come with no background of art are more excited to understand its potential of shifting something in them by the end of the semester, and then by the time they do the end semester exhibition, they're realizing that actually if we can channelize our thoughts into this kind of creative endeavor, there's a more powerful way of presenting them to the public, right? So art has that immediate publicness, that is, and I always say this, if you teach curating, one course I teach is curating. If you're drinking a cup of tea in your balcony of your residence hall in Ashoka, you got a great idea, but then the great idea needs to create a form for itself and produce a certain sense of publicness for itself. So the process of curating is to basically take that teacup idea and figure out a creative process for it, find out the artists or creative collaborators that are there, and bring it into a context where you can actually present it to the wider public. And I think that process is what actually curating and collaborating with artistic practices actually mean. Like, how do you find public interfaces for ideas? How do you find powerful ways of communicating your ideas that are not just self-help or inspirational kind of talks, but actually through material, experiential kind of realities that stay in your body for much longer than just kind of a temporary, like a hike in the adrenaline. And I think the slow burners are the beautiful ones that kind of subterraneanly share with you and just pop up in very different contexts and times. And I think art, even today, and this is somebody I'm saying it in very deep personal experience, not because I work in the arts, is that art does have that power if you let it have that kind of relationship with you, to kind of stay on with you in a very strange and beautiful way for a very long time, and then come back at very different times to kind of make sense of what's happening in the world, and maybe even give you language to talk about something that's very vulnerable, that's very difficult, that's very painful, traumatic, into a space where you feel safe and still be comfortable to express it. So I think that's I would say that's the beauty of creative practice and the process of even curating or working with creative practitioners on a daily basis.
Yeah, that's really beautiful to think about. Just one final question, like what are you like currently working on or paying attention working on, except for the 2 exhibitions that you already mentioned, or like just paying attention to that excites you in like the contemporary art scene like right now?
So one of the things that I am looking at is I've been of course we've spoken about the materiality part, but I'm also kind of right now looking at a lot about drawing as a materiality in itself, right? Because I just curated a show in Delhi of an artist called Jayati Bhattacharya, and it's called What Will Remain. And Jayati actually had this beautiful line when she articulates her relationship with drawing, which is like, drawing for me is an unfiltered way of looking at the world, right? What does that mean? And it kind of just broke something in me, like, what does this unfiltered way of accessing the world or looking at the world or representing the world mean? And how do we think about with other practitioners who are not specialized, but like specifically looking at the materiality of drawing? Because there are many others of my friends and people whose work I know who have really dedicated to this real specific materiality and form of drawing, right? And as of yesterday I was with Parul Gupta, a friend of mine, and we were talking about how a certain sense of like power of drawing, and also a form that is like something rigid, a limited form, can also provide a certain kind of freedom, right? So while you think drawing can be something that is limiting as a form, but it also creates this enormity of freedom within itself. And I'm somewhere very interested, and literally yesterday in response to something, this came, what is the freedom in a limitation? And we never really talk about the freedom in the context of a limitation, even if you want to look at it as a limitation, right? So yeah, and I think somewhere I think my mind is kind of right now dwindling in that idea, and to think about what is looking at the world without filters through drawing mean, and is it as powerful as it can be in other contexts, as Jayati is kind of feeling? Because with works you can see it and you can feel it. It's not that rocket science, because the body does sense something within the sense of a vibration when you look at an artwork that really embodies what they are kind of saying, right?
Yeah, I think with drawing maybe it's kind of like you don't have to worry about form, and you don't have to worry about like other things, which allows you that kind of mental freedom.
Absolutely.
But at the same time it could be limiting as well. Thank you so much. I think I'm going to stop like the recording now.